Jews have been here in the United States from early on. They didn't constitute a significant presence at the start, and they didn't really constitute a significant presence for quite a while during colonial and revolutionary times. What really changed that? It was immigration, and it was not just immigration from all over the world, but from some very specific places, and that has to do with, or that leads to the story of American Judaism that we think about today. In this chapter, we're not going to get the whole picture when we talk about denominations. You can speak in terms of really 5 main denominations or groupings of Jews within the United States: Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, that are talked about in this chapter, and then Reconstructionist and Hasidic, which they're just mentioned but not actually talked about in this chapter. So we're going to have to wait a little bit to get to those groups. But before that comes on the scene, we have a first distinction. The first Jews in America are Sephardic Jews. You remember that there was that distinction between the Sephardic and I always misspell this term, the Ashkenazi or Ashkenazi Jews. Do you remember the big difference between these two? They came from different places. Where were the Sephardic Jews from? Anyone remember offhand? I think I had a question about this on the exam. Maybe many of you didn't answer that one. Anyone remember? Spain, North Africa. Also Netherlands, or Holland, because they went from Spain to the Netherlands. And they were here first. And what did they try to do? We talked about this in an earlier chapter. Blend in, right? Their synagogues were built in such a way that you could tell it's a synagogue from the inside, but not so much from the outside. Where were these guys from?
Germany.
Germany's in one big place. Where else? Think about around, what else is bordering Germany? Go further east. Poland, at that time, had ceased to exist as a country. It was divided between Prussia and Austria and Russia. It's one reason why the Polish were so sensitive about, having their own representation here in the United States, because when you don't have your own representation, sometimes you get disappeared that way. But Poland, where else? Yeah.
Bavaria?
Yeah, well, that's part of Germany. That's southern Germany. Some northern Germans might, some northern Germans who are kind of biased think that barbarians aren't truly German, but thankfully that's gone away mostly. Where else? Further west, or further east, of Poland. What do you get to? I could use the Fiddler on the Roof reference, but I doubt that any of you have seen that because it's such an old musical. Oh, have you seen it? Okay, well, that's good. Do you remember where that was set?
No.
What country? No. Okay. So, what happens if you go further east of Poland? What do you get to? I'll give you a hint. They're in the news an awful lot these last couple weeks because they're engaging in some military maneuvers that have got everybody worried. Big country.
Russia.
Exactly. Yeah. So Russia, Poland, Germany, Lithuania, also a lot of Jews in Lithuania. And the Ashkenazi Jews are going to come later on through immigration. Now, the Sephardic Jews are able to make it into the upper and upper middle class. They're fairly Americanized. they've blended in. Many of them have been here for generations by the time that the Ashkenazi Jews are coming in. And the Ashkenazi Jews are coming in with much less resources. Many of them are actually speaking a dialect of German called Yiddish. It's kind of interesting. A lot of people don't understand where Yiddish comes from. Yiddish is a dialect of German that was spoken by Jews in Germany and in Lithuania, other areas, because they go on east. And for a long time, there was so much sort of anti-Jewish sentiment that Germans would say that they couldn't understand Yiddish. If you take younger Germans and you have them hear Yiddish, they can recognize it immediately as a dialect of German, which is what it is. So they're speaking a dialect of German that sets them apart because they're not speaking English. They tend to be segregating themselves into enclaves where other Ashkenazi Jews are settling as well. So like it says, communities of successful Ashkenazim had arisen in American cities from Atlanta to San Francisco. They established synagogues with rabbis, schools, hospitals, cemeteries. Immediately after the Civil War, American Jewry tended to be urban, German-descended, English-speaking, public school-educated, commercially oriented, quite prosperous, generally supportive of philanthropic causes. But then you have a vast influx of Eastern European Jews. So I'm talking about Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe. They're coming in with much less resources. They're coming in not speaking English. They're coming in not being that ready to adapt. And what happens is there's kind of a push on both sides. The Jewish minority tends to, kind of close in on itself, and there tends to be a lot of anti-Semitism being brought into American culture bit by bit by bit. The most virulent example of this would be the Ku Klux Klan, because the Klan was against three groups of people. Remember? Who were they? African Americans. Who else? Jews and
Hispanics.
Later on they take that on, but before that, who?
Gay Latino.
That's much later on. That's like the Klan of today. I'm thinking more like in the late 1800s, early 1920s when they had the resurgence. Yeah.
Catholics?
Yeah, because these were all seen as sort of non-American, foreign. Part of it was about maintaining segregation in place. Part of it was about keeping the other out. That would be the most virulent form. That was kind of a fringe thing in most places, except for like in the 1920s and 1930s, or in the South. But you have a lot of cases of institutions that originally would allow Jews in, slowly erecting barriers and saying, no, Jews can't apply here, or we'll only take so many Jewish students, setting up quota systems, things like that. So what's going on? There's a dynamic that's happening, in large part because of the immigration. And your book talks about the American Jewish community begins to organize efforts, primarily in New York. Why New York? Well, because that's where they're going to after Ellis Island. Organize efforts to help the newcomers orient themselves. Although both groups are technically Ashkenazim, the prosperous second and third generation merchants who had frequently adopted the Reform as their denomination were dismayed by the newly arrived remote kinspeople. They didn't like the poverty, the prevalence of Yiddish. Another thing that you can say about the newer Ashkenazim coming from Eastern Europe is that they were seen as term that they use is Oriental, meaning Eastern, meaning foreign, meaning kind of exotic. Their services were seen as being kind of strange. Just to give you kind of an example of this, a lot of the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim who had sort of established themselves, they saw themselves as being more similar in the way their services were run to, say, American Protestants, where you have very clearly delineated, this is what we're going to do now. Now we're in this part of the service. Okay, everyone shut up because, the minister is going to preach a sermon, that sort of thing. Whereas in a synagogue, for some of these newer immigrants, people would be milling around, doing whatever, going in and going out. It was seen as kind of strange, kind of unorganized, kind of typically, you use the term that they use there, typically Eastern. So what ends up happening is there's a division that takes place within the Jewish community. And if we get away from these ethnic things and we talk in terms of ideologies or ways of living out Judaism, Reform Judaism comes on the scene. And Reform Judaism was based in the Enlightenment. The same Enlightenment that religious liberalism that we've looked at before was based in as well. And what it tended to do was to say that Judaism was an ethical religion, to downplay what they saw as the ceremonial aspects. So, think about the Jewish law, the Torah, as we've talked about before. 613 commandments. Some of them are pretty, closely tied in with morals, like don't kill people, don't take bribes, don't move your neighbor's boundary markers to take over their land, those sorts of things. Some of them are hard to figure out how you would adapt to modern life, like the things about your tent getting leprosy. And there are laws about that. What to do if a tent gets these splotches on it. Some of them have to do with things like when you can actually have sex, when you can't have sex. Some of them have to do with what you can eat, what you can't eat. We've talked about the kosher laws, the kashrut. There's a lot of prohibitions. There's a lot of things that have to be done a certain way. And Reform Jews were willing to say, well, that stuff we can get rid of. That's no longer binding. The Torah has to be interpreted in terms of what modern life requires. So, like it says, Reform is one of the first of American Jewish traditions to adapt itself to the American denominational pattern. And how did they do so? So they sought their model in contemporary Protestant practice, and they adopted innovations like seating families together in pews. In other synagogues, the men would be seated on one side, the women in another place. Families would be split apart. Using organs and choirs, discontinuing the wearing of traditional marks like the, what's often called the skull cap, a yarmulke. Worn why? Because it's a mark of piety. Or wearing prayer shawls, right? All of that would be stuff that's just ceremonial. And so they thought, you need to get rid of that. That no longer, that's not modern. That doesn't fit in. They quit using Hebrew and started using German or English. So they started this as a change in practice, a change in liturgy, a change in the way the service went. And then they wanted to think of this in terms of something more coherent, an ideology. way of seeing the world and understanding the religion. And that's where this focus on ethics as what the religion was really about came in. The role of the rabbi changed from that of the traditional scholar of the Torah and Talmud to something more like a typical Protestant minister, preacher, counselor, and administrator. So this is what the elite, essentially, who were already established, this is what they gravitated towards. It was more American, more typical. What do you think happens as a reaction? Can everybody fit into this framework? Well, what if you believe that the Torah has to be followed down to the letter? What if you don't want your services to be in English and you want them to be in Hebrew? What if you think that the ceremonial stuff really matters? That's where, on the other hand, Orthodox Judaism comes about. Originally, Orthodox is actually a bad word that the Reformers are calling these stick-in-the-mud, conservative rabbis and congregations who want to keep doing things the old-fashioned way. They are traditional and hold on to the traditions. They believe that the Torah, with all 613 commandments, is to be followed. The services are to remain in Hebrew as much as possible. The rabbi is supposed to continue on being a scholar of Talmud and Torah. And the most importantly, well, not most importantly, but most distinctively, keeping kosher. Following the ritual codes about what can be eaten, what can't be eaten, how things have to be slaughtered, is continued. And your book talks about, if you ever go and you like, there's a number of different kosher signifiers that you can find for foods. Your book talks about a banquet that's held by the Reform Jews, and it may have been a catering mistake or it may have been something deliberate. They serve things, and this becomes a dividing line, they serve things that will violate the kosher law, like shrimp. So, could you step across that line and enter this, or were you going to stick with that? That divided them. A third, originally sort of mediating group were the Conservative Jews, and they're sort of a middle way between Reform and Orthodox. The Conservative, they want to fit themselves in between these two and combine what's best in both. There's a sense of participation in tradition, but adapted with each generation. They leave it up to the congregations to decide how they want to interpret the Torah, how they want to interpret the ceremonial requirements. And some are more conservative in that sense, and some are others. They emphasize home-centered rituals and the role of the family. Most of them keep kosher, but this is not universal. The law, or the Torah, is taken seriously, but adapted. And a couple other things that are distinctive about them is the having the synagogue center, combination house of worship with facilities for education, recreation, and other community activities. Seeing Jewish life as something holistic. So you've got these three major groups, and conservative Jews have kind of fluctuated back and forth. One of the real dividing lines between them, Reform Jews, they have female rabbis, and that follows pretty consistently from these Enlightenment ideas. no distinction between sexes of that sort. That's not going to fly for Orthodox Jews. Conservative Jews adopted that plank of having female rabbis, and that was a really decisive break between the conservatives and the Orthodox, because the Orthodox don't actually recognize female rabbis from conservative congregations as being rabbis. But they don't recognize many of their rabbis, male or female, as being rabbis because they don't have the same training and standards as the Orthodox. But there was at least some reciprocity there. So these are three of the main denominations. We haven't talked about Hasidic Jews yet, who play a major role in American Judaism today because of immigration. And we haven't talked about this very small group that actually broke off of the conservatives called the Reconstructionist Jews. But these are three of the major denominations, the three major ways of living out Judaism here in America. The ones that had a big role in the early 20th and mid-20th century as Judaism made its way into the mainstream. So that's where we'll leave off.